In this video, I'm going to talk about the WhirlyViz app, which is a free GeoViz tool that I recently put up on the Apple App Store. So let's get started. Now, WhirlyViz is an app, and it's free, and it does a number of interesting things, some of them complicated and some of them simple. So let's start with the basic stuff. It can display a base map, so a tiled base map from a remote source. It can display vectors on top of that base map, either tiled vectors or vectors from a GeoJSON file or what have you. And it can make SQL queries, so it can hit a remote database, such as one from CartoDB, and display the results of that. It'll do tile paging, so it can handle data sets that are larger than the available memory. And it does interaction and feedback, so when you tap on something, it can form a new query and get the results of that query from, again, a remote database. So let's dive into a demo. So there are two modes that WhirlyViz will work in. The first we're going to look at here is the configuration file mode. So let's take a look at an example based on a globe. So this is United Nations Environment Program data sets. And one that I like to look at is food supply quantity for meat. All right, so if we tap on the globe here, it'll figure out what country we're looking at and give us a statistic for that country. In this case, if we tap on the country again, we can see how much meat its people eat per day. 450 kilocalories in the case of the US. Canada's fairly similar. You see that Mexico eats a lot less meat. But if you poke around in South America, you'll actually find a country that eats even more meat than the US, Argentina. Of course, they grow cattle there, so there's a good reason for that. So this is a nice little app. If you see, you can poke around in the US or around the world. You can look at statistics on a country-by-country basis. And I built a number of apps like this. So the remarkable thing about this one is that it's all based on a configuration file. So all of this, all of the interaction, all of the feedback that the user is getting, all of the display, is controlled by a config file. So when we tap somewhere, a request goes off to a remote server, in this case CartoDB. Tap again, and another request will go off. And each of those will display their results as geospatial data. So since this is so flexible, let's look at another example. Now this is the primary land use tax lot output data, the Pluto data, from New York. And this is basically tax information on a lot-by-lot basis in New York. So if you zoom out, you see there we are, New York. And it's for all 5 boroughs. And again, this is a CartoDB example, so I'm fetching the data from CartoDB. Now, what's remarkable here is that as we move to a new area, we're actually fetching new tiles of data from CartoDB, so we're not fetching everything at once. Now, the data is ordered by height, so the more purple and violet buildings are the taller ones. And if you tap on them, you can see how big they are, who owns them, and information of that nature. Now, every time I tap, again, it's sending off a request to CartoDB and forming the result back up and displaying it to us. And again, this is controlled by the configuration file, so there's nothing unique between this example and the previous one. It's all in the config file. And I can play with this stuff endlessly. New York lot data is quite fascinating, and there's been a lot of interesting visualizations built on top of it. Okay, so that's the complicated mode because the config files are fairly complex. And in fact, a WhirlyViz config file consists of a whole bunch of JSON formatted information, basically to tell it what's supposed to happen when it starts up, what data it's supposed to fetch, what it's supposed to do when you tap somewhere, and so on and so forth. And then I use HTML for the pop-ups, so you can kind of take bits of that data out and then display it in a way that's intuitive to the user. And then of course there's the great SQL queries, then they could get a little dense. So every time that we're fetching a new tile of data, we're making a SQL query against the remote database and so on and so forth. And this can get really complicated. And it's not something that I've documented well, so instead of doing that, I recommend using URLs. So the simple mode that WhirlyViz can work in is by URL. And let's take a look at that. So here we're looking at a web page, and it has some nice embedded URLs. And if we tap on one of those, it'll bring up WhirlyViz and display in this case, just a globe with your sort of standard Mapbox example map on it, and then Chicago zip codes on top of that. And if you tap on the features, you'll see the actual zip for the feature. So this is just a GeoJSON file with some attributes, and we're just displaying it in a particular way. And the way we do this is much simpler than the config files. So let's look at another example here. Okay, we're gonna look at bike share availability in New York. And this is just a snapshot of bike shares in New York. I think it's a couple of years old. And again, this is a GeoJSON file. And in this case, it's a flat map, so it's not a globe. It's got one of the standard Mapbox data sets on it. And then on top of that, we've got GeoJSON data. So if we tap on it, we can see a fairly simply formatted display of the data. So how many bikes are available, when this was, looks like it's about a year old, maybe a little less, and so on and so forth. Not too helpful for getting a bike right now, but it's a great example. So it's what you can do is kind of limited only by what you can stick in a GeoJSON file. Anyway, that's the simple mode. And it's actually pretty simple to form these URLs. So I don't know if everybody realizes this, but you can make up your own URL scheme on iOS as well as Android. And the way it works is basically you make up a new URL. In this case, we've got WhirlyViz : and then that'll invoke the WhirlyViz app on iOS. Then we've got / display ? And that just tells WhirlyViz that you want to do some display. And then there are a bunch of arguments that follow that. And each of those arguments specifies a data set or how you would like the following data sets displayed or something of that nature. And these are the available options. And you could do things like display this particular base map given a JSON URL or a GeoJSON file to overlay, and you can overlay multiple of those. Whether you want the display to be a globe or a 2D map. And then how do you want the vectors displayed? Their width, whether or not they're filled, their color, things like that. And then you kind of form all that up into this dense URL you see at the bottom, which actually isn't all that complicated. Most of the complexities in the URLs that it contains. And when you click on that, you get that bike share example we were looking at before. So it's actually pretty easy to form your own. All you have to do is just download WhirlyViz, form one of these URLs. I like to email them to myself. Just kind of type them out and email them. And then when you tap on them, it'll invoke WhirlyViz with your data. So that's really all there is to it. It's a really simple way to display a GeoJSON file or multiple GeoJSON files overlaid on a globe or a map and interact with it in a really fluid manner. And you can also see attribution. So I'm curious to see what people may end up doing with this, and I'd love to see your examples. Please send them to me if you use it.